is the hiking trail.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fire road. So then you can see the Dawn Mine Trail there. So you would hit this road.
Okay.
And then you'd see Dawn Mine Trail. And when you hit the stream, you'd go upstream a smidge, and it's up on the left.
Uh-huh.
And then you can follow the trail along the stream all the way back to here.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
and what's that loop you were talking about?
That's the loop, yeah. So
okay.
take the trail to Sierra Saddle, and then take the trail up again to the fire road.
Okay.
And then go up the fire road a half mile or less, and you'll see on the side on the left the trail going down to Dawn Mine.
Okay, so it's right there where your finger is?
Yeah.
Yes, so this is interesting. So let's talk about this for a second, okay? So right now I'm looking at, there's a person, and again, I will have to send you, because I like to give credit where credit's due, but unfortunately I read so much stuff, I forget the names of people. But this is a person who calls himself a story technologist. So he does he says that he does the history of stories, and he uses basically tons and tons of data to break down different stories and to show how they actually, what they do to our brains, okay? And I'll send you a link to his work. But what I think is really interesting is I agree with him that there was a point in time when writing became a technology, right? And so with writing, stories were able to be written down. And so people like Plato and Socrates said, well, there's a new technology. And Aristotle did an analysis of the technology of stories. And he said, these are, in a sense, that's what Carl Jung was doing when he was talking about archetypes. He was talking about kind of the elements that create these stories that get told from culture to culture again and again and again, like the hero's journey, okay? So this mytheme, Levi-Strauss.
What do you call it, a mytheme?
Yeah, that's Levi-Strauss called it a mytheme. It wasn't a myth, because it was more than a myth. It was actually the very unit that created the different myths, right? Okay, so all right. So if I'm looking at stories as technology, when I went back to American Cosmic, and in order to try to push the method in my field, I had to embody and inhabit what I called a myth, which was the myth of Prometheus. I had to actually live it. And I was super uncomfortable doing that. And then after that, what happened was, in my next book, I've morphed into a new myth, embodying, inhabiting a new myth. And that myth is basically the allegory of the cave, which is, by the way, not called an allegory. That was a later imputation. So this idea of the cave, which, by the way, we see it again and again and again with the Truman Show or the Matrix, it gets played out in so many different ways in our culture right now, that we live in a simulation. The simulation hypothesis is basically another iteration of this mytheme, okay? Yeah, so that's it's almost as if I had to go through the Promethean myth in order to get to the allegory of the cave myth and inhabit that and understand it in order to write about it.
Does this mean that you've managed to get out of the cave? What do you mean when you say you're living that myth?
Yeah, okay, so I feel like after I wrote American Cosmic, in the myth, do you know the myth?
So my understanding of the cave myth, allegory, whatever one wants to call it, is that there are a set of people and they're tied up and they're looking at the wall, and on the wall are images, which are adumbrations, because they're shadows from something else. Well, we don't know that. They don't know that. They mistaken the wall, the cave wall, for quote-unquote reality, until one gets loose and then sees that these are mere projections of something else, and this outside world is the true quote-unquote reality. And then people have forgotten about the third part, which is that the sun was too blinding and they have to retreat into the darkness. Essentially, that there exists such a thing as too much truth. And also that they tell people, and many people consider them to be decerebrate and insensate, much like right now with people considering those who, well, if you have any belief that is borderline quote-unquote woo, then that's what one is labeled as.
Yeah. So that's generally good. Good job. Okay. So there are two things though that I think that we have to concentrate on. When I finished American Cosmic, I was like kind of obsessed with the cave. And so I went back and I read different versions of it, translations and everything, which then I realized, wait a minute, it's not actually an allegory. And wait a minute, it's in a book about politics. And so I thought this was strange. And I also thought I thought, who are the people that tie us up? And I asked a lot of my friends who happen to be philosophers. I said, have you ever thought about the people who tied us up in the cave? And they said, oh, no, it's just an allegory. And I was like, I don't think so. I think that people actually tied us off. And in fact, because of my experience with American Cosmic, I believe that people tied us up, right? And so I then wanted to tell
people.
Yeah, I think that people tied us up. I mean, in the cave, people tied us up.
I know what I'm saying is you believe now that people tied us up, or are you indicating that the extraterrestrials or whatever?
No. I think we're doing it to each other. We're misinforming each other. Like there's obviously this misinformation campaign that happened for UFOs. Let's just say that happened. We know it happened.
Yeah.
So people intentionally said, this is what's happening over here. What you see is real. But all of a sudden we're like, whoa, what I saw wasn't real. So I became kind of obsessed with that and trying to get my friends who are in philosophy to admit that people tied us up. And then I read it so many times that I realized that I was that person who was basically trying to convince people. And that what happens is you have to basically just leave the cave. But there's something at the end of the cave allegory. I'm just going to call it an allegory since people have called it that, but it's not. At the end, that person who escapes the cave and then goes back and tries to tell people that they're in the cave, and then they don't believe that person. And then that person spends a lot of time, precious time, basically saying, get out of the cave. Come on, I'll help you. But they don't. And they think you're crazy. And I thought, people think I'm crazy. And I said, I'm just going to stop because that's who I am. In this myth, I am that crazy person. He's basically telling people, we got tied up, everyone. Let's get out of the cave. Well, the next step is what my book is going to be about. The next step is the step of where that person leaves the cave and then what they do. Because they don't just leave the cave, Curt. They actually engage in something. And Plato calls it a craft, or Socrates does. Plato's the one who's writing it. But Socrates calls it a craft, not a flying saucer craft. A craft, right? Like a way of being that you engage in with another. And I think that's the heart of it. And that's what we forgot. Like we've been kind of hypnotized by the we are in a cave thing. And we forgot really what he was trying to tell us. And so I'm going to go back and kind of do a reading of that.
Where is the biggest population of man killer snakes?
In Florida?
Or in the U.S. in general?
Probably California's got a lot of rattlesnakes.
Really?
They got Southern Pacific rattlesnake. I've played with those before. That thing bites you. You're going to be bleeding out of your eyes, nose, and ears, and everything. It dissolves your brain. It's horrific. Now,
those are in California?
Yeah, Southern Pacific rattlesnake.
Let me recount it once more. So they see the shadows. Guy or girl comes out, notices quote-unquote reality, comes back, tries to tell people, and they don't believe him or her. Then this person leaves to do a craft.
Mm-hmm.
What is meant by that? In the book. I mean, sorry, not in your book necessarily, if you don't want to give it away, but in the allegory, quote-unquote allegory.
Yeah. So that's the question. What is meant by that? So that's, I think, the thing we need to ask. So what happens is that they go out of the cave, and then he's talking to, I think it's his brother, right? Or his brother-in-law or something. So when Plato recounts it, Socrates is talking to somebody, and he basically says, and wouldn't it be the case that we engage in this dialogue or dialectic, and that this is a craft, and that this is what we need to do. It's almost like if you want to know the answer for how to stay out of the cave, or the answer to help you, to deal with the reality that we live in, is to engage in this craft. And that's what he's trying to tell us. And this happens to be in a book about political philosophy. And I think that's really important. And I think that Iris Murdoch's book called, I think it's called The Good. It's something to do with the good. I just read it. But it's an excellent take on this. I think she gets it right.
And the take is that the good is to be political?
No, the good is to engage in this type of craft that Plato discusses. And it's an answer to the political. Because, in this talk, you and I have been talking about religion, democracy, secularism. We've been talking about these different forms of government and stuff. And Plato's basically showing us something. And then Heidegger, believe it or not, goes back and he tries to recreate that through writing this philosophy where he questions everything. And so he's basically doing exactly the craft. Although I don't think he actually gets it as much as Iris Murdoch does. So that's what's happening. And that's what our culture right now, we're stuck in the cave and we just don't know how to get out. And I think that's it. Because it took me a while to figure it out myself. Like, what is he saying? And then I had to read it. You know how you can read something so many times and then finally you're like, oh, that's what he's saying, right? Sometimes it takes a while because we've been so programmed to read it a certain way. But actually, I don't think that's the way it's meant to be read at all, the way that we've been reading it.
I was watching a talk of John Vervaeke's on Heidegger, and John was saying, in his language, so I'm going to use, and this is a bit esoteric, but he was saying that Heidegger was stating that the whole process of metaphysics for the past 2,000 years is one of distancing. We distance ourselves as a subject from the object, and this is perhaps a misframing, and that we shouldn't be seeking propositional answers, but instead participatory answers. So that is, that it's a difficult, I don't know how to, okay, let me think. So a dance is participatory. So there's a form of knowledge associated with dancing that's not propositional. It's not writing and then it's not logical per se.
100%.
Well, that's procedural as well. So there's another form. So are you suggesting that perhaps what's happened is that we've gotten lost thinking that by elevating the propositional knowledge and that what we need to do is go back to the participatory?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. I am exactly saying that the way that we've read The Cave, right, has been a propositional framework. We've used the propositional framework to read it, and we've neglected to see the most important point that it's trying to tell us, and that we have to go back and look at that and really engage with what it is that he told us back in the day. And I think that Heidegger tried to do that. He was successful, but I think that a lot of people just don't even understand what Heidegger was doing. And I think what you just said was correct. I think we have to be participatory in that way, engage, because the craft isn't engaging. It's a dialectic. It's a dialogue, and you do it with a person. And you know what I find fascinating is that you also see this in Buddhism. So there are these things called the 3 jewels of Buddhism. One is the Buddha. Not that you worship this guy named the Buddha. It's actually a title which means awake. And Buddhism, so you have Buddha as an example of what a human being can become. They can become awake. And then you have the Dharma, which is the teaching. And it doesn't have to be a book. It's anything that's going to wake you up. That's the teaching. And then you have the most important point, the Sangha. And that's the community. Because human beings live together. We don't live as, so we have to do this together. And I think that that's what Socrates was basically saying, they're all in the cave. Like, okay, sad for them. We tried to get them out, but now we have each other. And this is what we have to do to keep each other from being put back in the cave. He was saying that. And he demonstrated it in the book.
Is there an aspect of meaning associated with this, or rediscovering meaning?
Yeah, it's a meaning that's intrinsic.
Now, here's the reason I say that. It's because from my understanding of Heidegger, and Heidegger is one of the hardest people to read.
Yeah, I agree. He makes up his own language.
but he was saying, look, what a lover does is if you love your spouse, you give them flowers. You don't give them plants. You don't give them subjects of horticultural investigations. But they're the same. They're actually the same.
They
the plant
are.
and the flower
Yeah,
and the
you're
horticultural
right.
investigatory object is the same. However, it's wrong to give your spouse a plant for Valentine's Day. And so it's because even though the literal is the same, the meaning isn't. And there's something about recapturing meaning or looking at something in the correct way that Heidegger was pointing to. One of the reasons I like Heidegger is that, in some sense, remember I was giving you an outline of what theories of everything is? Mm-hmm. Now, no way am I saying it's a continuation of Heidegger's project, but it's similarly themed in that he was suggesting that that a project should be that we should be understanding our being in order to understand our relationship to being, in order to understand being. And well, what is being? Well, being is... I don't know how to describe what Heidegger would say being is other than existence. And earlier you mentioned that Heidegger was interested in why something exists. I think that Wittgenstein was interested in why something exists and how something exists, where Heidegger was interested in existence. What is existence itself?
I agree with you. I think so. I think also that Wittgenstein realized that language actually couldn't contain a lot of what existence is about. And then, he kind of gave up on it. And he said, I think his famous quote is, of that which we cannot speak, we should remain silent, which I, of course, don't agree with, because then you have art, right? And music. So let's not remain silent. That would take away a good part of what living is about. So, yeah.
Well, he also was an artist. I don't know if he meant language per se, rather than art. Mm-hmm. Maybe art was all right as a mode of expressing oneself, to understand the world. It's strange, because I was looking up Heidegger, and Heidegger apparently was an atheist, but I see him as, in a sense, wrestling with God or trying to figure out what God is. And same with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I don't think he explicitly called himself an atheist, but either way, Norman Malcolm, I don't know if you know this, his friend Norman Malcolm said the religiosity that characterized Wittgenstein was greater than the average religious person. And Wittgenstein, he said he can't help but see every problem through a religious point of view. But I see Heidegger similarly, where even though he may say he's an atheist, it seems like what he's doing is trying to understand God.
Well, I mean, there's a reason why I'm very attracted to his work, and I find it to be mystical. I think that his later work was, he had a mystical experience, and they tried to express that understanding through his, and I think that's why he went pre-Socratic. He went back to Socrates and pre-Socratics in order to express what he thought we had lost as a culture.
Have you heard from many of the people who are on the more Buddhist / Eastern end that would say that you cannot discover God or reality or whatever synonym one wants to give it that has some dramatic flair to it? You cannot discover it via an analytical approach, that you must experience. It has to be something that is beyond language. Firstly, have you heard that? And then secondly, if you have, do you believe that to be the case?
Yes. So I would say that beyond Heidegger's writing and Hannah Arendt's writing, I was very influenced by the writings of the people involved in what's called the Kyoto School. So the Kyoto School was a Japanese school of Zen Buddhism philosophers. They didn't call themselves religious. Religion wasn't even a term for them. But they were using Zen in order to explicate like philosophy, and that's how Heidegger kind of got involved with them. And one of the books that I think is most fascinating, I think it's called The Philosophy of Nothingness. And I forgot exactly who wrote it, but it's that person. That's where he links. He actually went back and read Nietzsche and kind of through the lens of Zen Buddhism. And I thought it was a fascinating book. So if you're interested, it's The Philosophy of Nothingness. So yes, absolutely. That's what he was basically saying. I mean, I also think that Nietzsche was a mystic as well. His philosophy is basically mysticism.
Now, Nietzsche's someone that I feel horrible for not liking, because everyone likes Nietzsche and everyone likes Jung, but I don't. I just can't. I'd rather read what other people have said about him than go to the primary source, which is anathema to scholars, because it's, well, to me, the way that I view it, it's like wine. For me, when I drank, which I don't drink anymore, but I was never partial to wine. to wine. I'll have some of it, but then same with the stronger drinks. They don't taste good. But I'm not going to torture myself by constantly drinking it in order to get the quote-unquote acquired taste. So I think that's what's necessary in order to understand Nietzsche properly.
No, it's not. Did you not read about my Nietzsche synchronicity that caused? Because I hated Nietzsche.
Yeah. Well, good for you in the sense that you're lucky that you had that.
No, I know, because I would have continued to hate Nietzsche as well, just like you. And good for you. I would be very suspicious of a person who naturally liked Nietzsche, frankly. I think you have to encounter Nietzsche. So yeah, I mean, a lot of what he says is horrible.
So I'm much more of a Lovecraftian in the sense that you mentioned the cave allegory, and I'm much more inclined to feel like that, and I used to be of the type that give me the truth no matter what form it comes. But I've had some experiences where I feel like sometimes the truth is far too much for you to handle, and you can damage yourself drastically from an encounter with the truth. And Lovecraft had this quote, which to me I interpret as the case for ignorance. And it's something like, the greatest mercy in the world is the inability for the human mind to correlate its contents, and that one day we'll see that this unfettered scientific investigation may bring about such a terrifying vista of reality that we'll see our fragile place in it and be so frightened that we'll either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and security of the Dark Ages. So, in the cave allegory, I see that as the person who runs back in the cave. Now, you mentioned that there may be a solution to that, and I'm praying and I'm hoping that your book provides some solution to that, because right now I'm fleeing from the light, let's say.
You mean you're going back into the cave?
Yes, I wish and I hope and I pray for the cave. I think that the more fiendish and cursed aspects of a quote-unquote open mind haven't been explicated by people or even recognized, that it's seen in this culture as something that everyone should have more of. And I think that my mind has been somewhat too open, and I need to close it. And it's not pleasant to have such an open mind. And
you know what?
I'm not saying that as something, yeah.
Yeah, that's where the Sangha comes in. That's where you have to have people that help you.
Well,
because it's not easy to have an open mind, especially when everyone around us is, like they are. And that's why that's why it's necessary. It's not just something helpful. It's necessary.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading that book. Do you have a title?
Right now I'm calling it The Resurrected.
It's
because
good.
it's people that have gone through death in a sense and are now alive again. And so I thought they're resurrected.
Yeah. Have you gone through... Well, what's the difference between epistemic shock and ontological shock?
Okay, so I think that epistemic shock is when you realize that the world you thought you knew and the assumptions that you had about it were wrong. And that instigates probably ontological shock, where it's ontological in the sense that you can no longer live the same. Like, the ways in which you live now have to change. So I see them as happening at one right after the other. One is kind of theoretical, and the other is institutional.
Well, okay, to make a play on words there, I feel like I have gone through somewhat of each of those shocks and have almost been to the point where I need to be institutionalized. And so it's actually extremely frightening to study consciousness and what reality is, and to constantly have one's worldview shattered and even do so for a living, which is what this channel is. It's not pleasant, and it's not pleasant. Luckily, I'm like just getting out of it. It's only by the grace of God, just getting out of it, but it's not pleasant. I'm wondering, what was your epistemic and ontological shock? Specifically, was there a moment?
Yes. It happened in, I think it was 2012, and it was during a whole weekend. And it was just after I think it was in March that the tsunami happened in 2011. And that was shocking, of course. But after that, I had a very, very real sense of impending, this could happen. And it's terrible, like a whole civilization could like get washed out, or, something could happen, and apocalyptic kind of feelings. And that's when I was doing the research that I was doing into the UFO realities. And that's when I went back and I looked at some of the primary source material for Catholic history, and I realized what was happening now, and that people, and that's when I met people who seemed to care that I knew. And those were like, the people we referred to earlier. And I guess the reality of this shocked me on a level that I call it pre-UFO Diana and post-UFO Diana, right?
Okay.
And it definitely wasn't pleasant. So it was, and it lasted, it was for the weekend, it was so destabilizing.
It's a great word.
Yeah, so I was destabilized. But I had a lot to fall back on because I'd studied religion my whole life. So I knew from Buddhism and from Catholicism that there are ways to get through this, because I read it, it's called, St. John of the Cross calls it the dark night of the soul. Okay.
Oh, you want to, sorry, just as a quick side, I was being interviewed by someone telling them about my experience, and they said, Curt, it sounds like you're going through the dark night of the soul.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's the dark night of the soul. So, okay, so think about it now. I've read all of this and knew all of these things. So I already had something to fall back on, which is why you don't. But, Nietzsche comes in handy here, because Nietzsche went through it too. It almost seems like he didn't survive it, frankly, because he didn't have a Sangha, it didn't seem like, and he didn't have, Heidegger had the Catholic tradition, which he was able to, and he also had his friends at the Kyoto school, try going through Satori experiences and stay stable, right? So, so he had like a lot of people. So I think that's something that we have to take into consideration here, is that I think, stay away from, like, gather around yourself some people who have been through it, so that they can say, oh yeah, been there. You know what I mean? So like, I get it, so you need a Sangha. So that's what I had. I have a woman named Sister Rose. So she's a Catholic Ursuline sister. And this is how she put it. She said, Diane, she said, this is what's going on. She said, and Jeff Kripal has a book called Flipped, in which he talks exactly about this. He says, you flipped.
Jeff Kripal.
Yeah, he's at Rice University. You should have him on your show. He's great. So he's a professor at Rice University, and basically he went through the same. He was in training to be a monk, and then he recognized that he couldn't be, so he became a professor of religion. And he had some cool experiences. Okay, so but he knows what this is about, and so does Sister Rose. Sister Rose said, we tend to think that the world is like how we were brought up to believe. And then all of a sudden we have experiences that show us that the world is actually not like that at all. And then sometimes we never get over that. She says, but we're here, like, her order, and her and the Catholic, the people of the church, that had mystical experiences. She said, this tradition is here to tell you that we are in the world, but we are not of the world. And that actually makes sense now to me, because I was like, that's what that means. She said, it's really like the way you see it now. That's really how the world looks. But it's not like how these other people see it. She said, they just think that it's like that. But they're not actually, it might happen to them too at some point. They might get flipped. She goes, but mostly it probably won't, because it doesn't happen to everyone. It only happens to a few. So does that make sense? So there are people to which this has happened, and now they live in this reality. And that reality for them is is the normal reality.
What do you mean when you say the world is actually how it looks?
Well, when I say, okay, so, when you've gone through a night of the soul, the dark night of the soul, and the next day, or, when, for me, it was that weekend. And then I said to myself, okay, I have a new perspective on what life is about. And now I'm going to have to live with this new perspective. I don't know what it's going to be like. And so that's what she was trying to explain to me. She was trying to explain that you don't have to go back to the perspectives and use those as tools for interpreting the world. She said, you're fresh. It's like you're born again. You're new in this new world. And now you have to use different tools. But thankfully, because I've been studying about religion or philosophy my whole life, I had all those tools. But I just didn't know that that's what I was doing my whole life. I was preparing myself to kind of do that by learning those tools. And now, like, I have a lot of people who come to me who are students or, who are grown-ups, and this has happened to them. And they're like, what do I do? And then I give them, I say, okay, this is, a lot of times in their own tradition, they'll have a book that they read, but they forgot about. And then they'll go back and they'll say, oh, so people have gone through this.
And the Sangha, I imagine that's a community where people have similar values. What is it defined as?
Yeah, so in the Buddhism, it's the Sangha is the community of people who are waking up and helping each other stay awake. Because Buddhism is about waking up from the illusion.
Yeah.
So they're waking up.
So
yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's where I am. I used to envy people. I don't want to be awake any longer. And there's great research that says sleep is helpful, sleep is healthy, we're not sleeping enough. I would like to go back to sleep personally.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I understand. But the Sangha is there for you when you go through the process of awakening. They're there to help you out.
Well, anyway, you mentioned that you were pointing out to Tyler there's some part of something written in Latin. He said,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't even know. He also mentioned it's to tell them, quote unquote, that they dominate. So I wasn't sure who the them and the they were referring to. So why don't you talk about that, please?
Yeah, okay, so that was really interesting. So one thing that was kind of funny about my friendship with Tyler was that he was part of the space program. He was really integral into the space program, and he launches, these rockets and works with SpaceX and that type of thing. And what I found out, which he actually did not know, and I pointed it out to him, was that the whole thing was a ritual. The whole thing was ritualized. So they identified certain time periods astronomically when it would be beneficial to launch. And they also the rockets had Roman gods on them. And they also had Latin, first century Latin, not medieval Latin. It wasn't Catholic Latin. It was basically imperialistic Latin. And everybody had to stay in their own space. Like there was a place where they had to stay. They wore the same clothes for every mission. And they ate the same food.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Are you referring to a SpaceX launch? I missed that.
Yeah. Not all SpaceX launches, just certain of them with Tyler involved. And so when he would be involved launching these satellites into space, a lot of times they'd be with SpaceX because that's who they used.
I see.
Yeah. So they would go, they've been doing this it looks like from the 1950s onward, they've been doing this ritual. And they would even have like a chaplain there. And, it was very, it was very ritualized. And so I noticed that and I asked him about it and I said, do you know that this is first century Latin that's written on these rockets? And he said, no, I didn't know that. He didn't even know it was Latin. And so we read them, I translated them all and I said, this says that. And I said, who up there in space is going to be reading this? Like, why would you put that on there? That seems so strange. And he said, well, I imagine it's for them. And I said, okay, who are they? And so he just didn't say anything, but that's what it was.
So the two questions that occur is, firstly, what did it say? And then also, does this mean that Elon Musk himself is putting those messages there? Like Elon is a believer in ETs and so on, or is it just one of the staff members?
No, this is way before Elon, so it has nothing to do with him. His company is just a company that puts those does the launches to get the satellites up, but he has nothing to do with creating the satellites or of putting the Roman stuff on them. Nothing at all to do with that. That was definitely predates him. So what does it mean though?
What was written on it?
Yeah, so to me, it looks like what people have called like exotheology or astrotheology. It's this kind of, well, I call it, it's not a specific religion, but it's a religiosity of people who are involved in the space program. And it's this, it's Roman. The United States kind of considers itself Roman. Look at our, architecture and that type of thing. We're like the new imperial place, right? And so I think that's what it has to do with. They're using the images of gods and goddesses from Rome. And what does the Latin say? Here's something for you to check out. It's they're called patches. And have you seen those patches? Okay, so
haha, we don't know, or haha, we know, but you don't?
Yeah, yeah. And so a lot of those are in Latin, and that's where you see, and a lot of those would be on the actual satellites. The images would be on the satellites. And then people who were working the mission, they would get the patch.
Uh-huh. And so the haha part, was that on the satellite, or that was just on the patch?
Usually you just have the god or goddess and the image, like the dragon or something like that, on the satellite with the Latin phrase that accompanies it. And the Latin phrases are different for each launch.
You also mentioned there's a picture of that you were going to send to the audience at that time, because remember, I'm listening to the lecture, and you said, yeah, if anyone's interested, I'll email it to you. Can you email it to me so I can place it on screen right now? Not right now, sorry, when I'm editing this. I'll make a note to remind you of that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I could get it right now if you want.
The image is being displayed right now, so if you're listening to this on the audio platforms, then I recommend you click the YouTube link in the description. What you're seeing is the high quality capture. Unfortunately, the source images are fairly low. You also someone referred to the president as a short timer. Okay, what does that mean?
Yeah, so and I'd heard this from not just Tyler, but a lot of the people who were part of the program, that presidents are short timers, in the sense that there must be a program that's not a short time program, but a long time program. And therefore the presidents come and go, and therefore they're not given the information. Think of Tyler. Tyler's been doing this since he was at least 20 years old. And now he's in his 60s. I mean, he's a long timer. And so he has a lot of information. And the presidents don't have all that information. They're only given the information that they need to know.
I know that we've mentioned Tyler's pseudonym plenty, and I don't think everyone here knows who Tyler is or what the story is around Tyler, so do you mind quickly just outlining that so that people can rewatch and say, oh, okay, now that makes sense. I didn't give the context to who Tyler was.
Sure. Okay. So I wrote this book, I called it American Cosmic, in reference to the Russian cosmists, because to me, Russian Cosmists is a great book for any of our listeners, by, I think it's Henry Young, and it's about the belief systems of the people who started the Russian space program. And so when I started American Cosmic and I met Tyler, he had a very similar belief system. And Tyler was this person who actually reached out to me, and he was part of a secret program. Now they're known not to be secret. And he had clearances and that sort of thing. And he worked for almost every space shuttle launch. Okay, he's a mission controller. And he was a very fascinating person. I kind of kept him at a distance for about 1.5 years before I actually met him in person. And then he took me and Gary Nolan to New Mexico to an alleged crash site for UFOs, because he told me that UFOs from the 1940s, he told me that I didn't believe in UFOs. And he said, you only believe in them as kind of like imaginary things. He said, what if I showed you evidence that? And so this was where I was like automatically suspicious. I was like, wow, this is crazy, but I'll go. Because, it's still evidence, it's still data, even if it's disinformation, it's still data. So anyway, so that's who Tyler is. Tyler's this fascinating space program person.
Do you believe that the government believes that they understand what's going on behind the UFO phenomenon?
No.
So they realize that they don't know what's going on, or you think that they have a handle on it?
I think that there's probably a number of, you know how in the United States we have Democrats and Republicans and things like that. I think that the government is pretty much, the space program is like that. There's different factions within it, and some of them are tasked with trying to figure this out, and some of them think they know what it is about, and some of them know, well, we don't know what this is about. So that's how I think it really is. It's compartmentalized, and that's why I use a lot of references to this movie and book called Fight Club, and it's basically about this person. Well, probably your audience knows, but that's what it looks like. So before it was the Invisible College, where people worked together who were scientists, and they were secret, and they were trying to figure out the stuff under cover of secrecy. But then it morphed into, I think in the late 80s and early 90s, it morphed into Fight Club, where people didn't even tell each other what they knew in order to keep the secrets.
Do you believe that we're dealing with multiple phenomenon that have different explanations rather than a single one?
Yeah, definitely.
So why do you think that?
Because they look very different. So orbs look different than Tic Tacs, which I don't even know if they are extraterrestrial. And there are things that, like, I could see from Catholic history from, like, 1400, 1500, that look like John Mack's abductions, and you can say, wow, that looks exactly like, it could come out of John Mack's book. I think it's called Abduction, actually, Human Encounters with Aliens. So yeah, those are different. I mean, I think they're different. I could be wrong, but they look different.
Have you seen this video, one video, I believe, called Biblically Accurate Angels?
Yeah, I like that video.
Okay, I'll link it, or I'll even display some of it here for people to watch. Now, does anything that you've learned about the phenomenon ring true with those depictions?
Yeah. I mean, when you look, so if you look at angels even, you have to say that even if you take this category of thing called angels, which we all think we know what they are, but if we go back to the biblical text where they derive from, you'll see that none of those encounters look the same. So even angels don't even look the same to one another. So you have angels that take on they look like humans, and they fight with, like, Jacob, and they dislocate his hip and things like that. And then you have these angels that look very weird, and scary. And then you look at Saint Francis, and his situation with and it looks like an angel. They call it a seraphim, right? And it zaps him, and he gets these things which the Catholic Church calls stigmata, but they look like burns, right? And so I mean, once you start to get to the primary source materials of these things, they look very strange, and they don't look at all like what we have, what has come down to us as what they're supposed to be like. Like Saint Teresa of Avila, she's a person who had an experience, and now it's made popular in Rome. Bernini created a statue called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and it's in Rome, and you can see it. And it's this beautiful statue of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, it looks like, with this little cherub like angel next to her. But if you actually read it, if you read the account of it, which she wrote, she basically says, I don't know what thing this is. I don't know if it's an angel. And then she said, all I know is that usually I see angels in my mind as an imagination, and this one is real. It's actually fleshy, and it's about 3 feet tall, and it's all in light. And it also has this long thing that has a dart at the end, like kind of like an arrow, and it like basically sticks her with this arrow. I mean, that's creepy, and that's exactly what she said about it. And then you have this beautiful statue that doesn't look anything like the very strange, scary narrative.
One time I was talking to Jim Inks, and I told him that he needed to start a YouTube channel, doing tobacco reviews. He said that if he did it, he wouldn't want to just do tobacco reviews. I told him he could do his cartoon art and tobacco reviews. It would be a smash hit. Nobody wants to be a one-trick pony after all. Old Jim knew Mickey Spillane from the golden era of Marvel Comics. He used to get into long conversations with Mickey. I would love to hear some of those stories. Jim is also a JFK assassination buff. I need to get him on the horn and we'll do an episode about JFK. Maybe RFK as well. When Tom O'Neill wrote his book Chaos about Charles Manson, it brought him right to the heart of the JFK Lee Harvey Oswald conspiracy theory. My research picks up where Tom O'Neill left off. From the Free Medical Clinic in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, O'Neill followed Charles Manson, whereas instead I followed Ken Kesey. My search led to Woodstock, the last thread of which led me to identify two individuals with the same name, both linked to the Frankfurt School and the New School here in America. One was a hippie elder of the Cultural Revolution, Michael Lang, and the other was tech CEO who served a foundational part not only in the digitization of society, but as a founder of the New School as well. If you don't know what the New School is, that's where a lot of the Marxists you're dealing with today came from. Tim Leary gave the CIA full credit for the countercultural revolution of the 1960s. At the entrance to Langley, at CIA headquarters, there is a Bible verse set in stone at the entrance. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. What do you think that truth is? Spillman Mixture is an incredible blend. The full-bodied mix of Burley, Latakia, Oriental Turkish, and Virginia uses a mild topping to bind all of the flavors together nicely. This is like a journey back in time to an older American-style blend. According to the blender's notes, they resurrected this mixture from a 100-year-old recipe. It reminds me a lot of Beehive Cigars' Frog Morton Match Blend. This has been my go-to blend while I've been up in the hills prospecting, and I have to say it goes well at all points of the day. There's nothing like having a nice tin of tobacco available when you're on the San Gabriel River. Pipestud says this stuff reminds him of Barking Dog from the House of Windsor. Barking Dog is no longer in production, so you can grab some of this Spillman Mixture if you're missing that old-timey flavor of rough-cut American tobacco. This blend is rich but mild. Jim thought it lacked flavor, but for a lot of people that's the reason it's an all-day smoke. The leaves have been perfectly balanced and given a light topping, maybe just a bit of molasses or something like that, which balances the leaves out quite well in my opinion. The topping or casing is very light. People buy this blend for the old tin. I certainly did. I loved the little tax stamp stickers on it. But they go back for the flavor. If you're just getting into English blends, or if you like the old American style English blends, this could be for you. If you look at the history of the OSS, which later became the CIA, and their involvement in spreading psychedelics and transforming American culture from Leave It to Beaver to the 1960s counterculture, it would be very easy to link that hidden truth that will set you free with the people who chained us up mentioned earlier by Professor Diana Sulka. As American society begins to become more interested in things like metaphysics and interstellar or interdimensional travel, it is important to look back at the teachings of the ancients, which contained eons of writings and possible answers to the emerging physics and mathematics that modern society has encountered. In a hearing before Congress yesterday, 3 people involved with UFO UAP experiences testified before Congress that the U.S. government is in possession of what they believe to be non-human technology. At one point in the hearing, for about 30 seconds, the main witness gave an explanation of the interdimensional theory of space travel.
You have mentioned that there's interdimensional potential. Could you expound on that?
And in terms of multidimensionality, that kind of thing, the framework that I'm familiar with, for example, is something called the holographic principle. It derives itself from general relativity and quantum mechanics, and that is, if you want to imagine a 3D object such as yourself casting a shadow onto a 2D surface, that's the holographic principle. So you can be projected, quasi-projected from higher dimensional space to lower dimensional. It's a scientific trope that you can actually cross, literally, as far as I understand, but there's probably guys with PhDs that we could probably argue about that.
His answer was essentially Plato's cave. I was talking to a librarian the other day, and she said that she feared her career was in jeopardy due to the turn toward technology. Just the opposite, I said. With the emerging theories in high-energy particle physics, the ancient texts just became more valuable than ever. I packed my pipe again and lit the bowl, smoke swirling up, her eyes opened wide like a book. There is a technology to stories, and we have much to discover. The hero's journey folds out before you like a road to where the sidewalk ends. I looked up the Latin on one of those patches, by the way. Numquam ante, numquam iterum. It turned out to be the title of a song written by Jim Henson of Muppets fame. Never before, never again. The lyrics of the song ask, is this an angel's wish for men? Never before and never again. Sometimes I feel like the hints of the secrets to life are hidden like breadcrumbs along the path for you to find your way to the end. Maybe never before, maybe never again.
Darkness of future past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds. Fire, walk with me.
Hey, listen, I'm going to play a little song here, which you're going to sing. And would you like to tell the audience a little bit about it?
All right. It comes at a very poignant moment in the Muppet movie, where Miss Piggy first sets eyes on Kermit, falls in love, and she sings, "Never before and never again."
Shall we begin?
Let's do it. never before have two souls joined so freely and so fast. For me, this is the first time and the last. Is this an angel's wish for man? Never before and never again. And where to find the words to sing its worth? This love was bound for heaven, not for earth. This love was meant to light the stars, but when we touched, we made it ours. And could they take it back? Oh no, they wouldn't dare. Why should they take it back when there's enough to share with all the world and fill the heavens above? Never before a love that just keeps growing on and on to fill each lover's heart and light the dawn. Is this an angel's wish for man? Never before and never ever take it back when there's enough to share with all the world and fill the heavens above. Leftover love never before, a love that just keeps growing on and on to fill each lover's heart and light the dawn. Is this an angel's wish for man? Never before